Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Hospitality Marketing, live show number 388 on a Friday the 13th. I am your host, Loren Gray, and thank you for joining us live if that's what you're doing on either Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube, multiple pages, multiple channels. Or if you'd like to see my bright and shiny smiley face on your TV, you can go to Roku, Amazon, Apple, or Google and look for the hospitality channel, and the live show is always on the free side of our channel that is there. That way you can sit back, relax with a cup of coffee, even though I have a face for radio. So thank you again. This is our second show of 2023. As such, new year, new issues, new things, new conversations, of which there's a few things in the news we'll get to a little bit, but I really want to talk about, I wouldn't say a grievance, as a little bit of a peek behind the curtain as to modalities and methods associated with this ancient and charming process. No, I'm just kidding. How do you really decide your daily rate changes? I've had the pleasure of sitting in every chair around the table when it comes to these meetings. I even had the privilege of representing ownership when in this case. But let's start from the ground up. I was a department head at a hotel, food and beverage primarily initially. That I was a part of the conversations associated with revenue management. When we had revenue management conversations back then, it was reservations. It wasn't called revenue management. That's how far back. I've been in the chair from a sales perspective at the property level. I've been there from in the perspective of marketing chair from the property level, from the GMs and director of ops positions, and revenue management. I was revenue manager for hotels. I've sat in all the positions around the property. Then from there, moving up, I was in regional capacities for all same said departments. And all seats. And then at a corporate level, I was representing corporate interest around the table as well. And even when it came to discussions with brand, I represented ownership interest in revenue management conversations with the property. So I say all of that not to beat my chest, but to actually talk about the fact that I have a first person perspective as to the roles, responsibilities, and communication engagements associated with the revenue management call. Now, this isn't to call out anyone when it comes to the process of how revenue management calls run. At the core, revenue management is the process of deciding what we are selling our product for, primarily rooms. That is based on a lot of factors we'll get to in discussion. On the other end of the pendulum, and it's incredibly valuable that we define that. It shows a granularity on a day-to-day review as to what rate we are asking for our rooms and our room types. On the other end of that pendulum is the absurdity of decision making that often goes on in these calls. They're very political, they're very sandboxed, they're very affirmational. They're not really rooted in a group decision process. Group decisions create camels, not horses, for anybody familiar with that analogy. It's oftentimes informational, not decision based. It's meant for the value of engagement by bringing in and soliciting people from the different departments, different components of this. A feeling of participation is meant to be from this. So there's that political communication aspect of it. Nobody wants to work in the dark. And I'm a huge fan, biggest fan of communication and open-ended awareness of what we're doing and deciding in the different departments so that we collectively can make good decisions for the property. That being said, the processes of revenue management I have witnessed in a spectrum. And again, this is no reflection on my clients that I currently have. I have great client conversations, great client revenue meetings, so forth and so on. I also have the reverse of that. And that is a lot of times endorsement is more important than strategy. And I will break this down into why I say that. Oftentimes, the reality of the conversations, and there's three chairs that surround primarily for the decision process of revenue strategy. The GM is ultimately responsible for the property. Now, some operations put that elevate the position of revenue manager to be ultimately responsible for the decision making of the property. But I'm being more classical. I'll say GM managers have the final authority as to what they approve as their rates for the days that are reviewed. You have the person that's proposing it. Now, that could be a third-party entity, a vendor that you've been brought in, or your own person at property, and or nowadays, given the way revenue management is being run from a centralized place, non-property specific, that could be a remote person on payroll for the ownership of the hotel or management company of the hotel. facilitating the decisions of the revenue strategy for that hotel. So you have third party and or that. And then you have the vested interest of the ownership as to the revenue goals associated with these decisions. That's pretty much the core three. Now you can pepper in a few other positions of sales, marketing, and so forth, depending upon the conversations as to group discussions, group rate blocks, displacement value, ancillary revenue from groups and events, where food and beverage would be a part of the play, banquets, and so forth. That all is a part of the dynamic associated with revenue management. But the core of revenue management strategy is to say, what are we charging for our types of rooms on this date and why? The why, I feel, doesn't get answered a lot. The why is usually a feeling, a premonition, an experience-based perspective. I do not find it often related to data and the idea that data is being used to make these decisions. Let me say this from the perspective of how this conversation usually work. So we're looking at a series of dates. We have a report. Now, gosh knows, and I say this with the ultimate of positivity to this, that softwares being used by brands, bought by brands and or facilitated for brands, third-party softwares, revenue management softwares, I'm talking about the Duettos of the world and rate gains and so forth and so on, have become very much a key component to this process. They provide data. They're providing great graphs and charts that no longer, as a revenue manager, you had to generate what all your rates and room types were for every date. And then, of course, looking at your comps and manually entering in that data. Those days are gone. Now, for people familiar, star reports are a forensic view backwards. They are they have more advanced ones you can buy where there's a little more relevance to looking to yesterday, but you're still looking in the rearview mirror for revenue against what you did versus what produced versus your competitors to gauge and sense the impact of your previous choices on the actualization of them. Software facing forward is the ticket of the day. There's so many platforms that provide these. There's mandated platforms for the brands that you have to use. There's an internal industry knowledge as to which softwares over exaggerate or miscalculate, and you manually adjust the projections that these softwares do because you know that that is a quirk of the platforms. I'm talking to you, Hilton. And Marriott, really. So you have variations that you have to create on the reports that will temper that down. It's a little bit like if you ever have to take your blood pressure, every blood pressure color is never the same. And you have to know what the variance is for that particular one to know what the probably real number is for it. Same too with revenue management softwares. There's this projection that's based on historical data. And as we have talked about many times on the live show, our historical data is skewed at best because we have so many variant years. 2021 full lockdown, 2021 uncertainty, 2022 emergence. We're now in 2023. So the only real relevant normalcy of demand to market is 2019. So you have to create an average weighted mean between all these years to get the data to be used. Well, these softwares don't tend to do that. Softwares look at the year over year or period over period. And because of that, they often will skew their projected revenues or occupancies or rate suggestions because of the data that's being provided into them. So with that comes this dance of conversations in these calls. Let's just say that the party that's representing the revenue strategy is your own internal team's revenue management group. Okay, so there's no vendor interpretations, which is a part of the politics of it. There's just a person that's on payroll from a management company or ownership or from the hotel itself, just centralized to multiple properties if that's what they have. That is they're projecting what they think should be the rates for the room types based on what they're aware of in the upcoming times. Now you have pretty much 4 segments that get discussed. The immediate 7-day. What's actually happening this week? How are we looking today, tomorrow, next 7 days? Then you have kind of a push into the next 30 with a hard emphasis on the next 14 days. That next 30 days or the upcoming 30 days is very granular in the sense of what particular groups are running in particular ways. What's their block? Are they going to fill their block? Are they going to wash? Your wholesalers, are we washing those out? What's the real reservations that are going up? We're in that booking opportunity to know what the actualization is closer to. In mathematical terms, you should be less than 3% off at this point for your upcoming 30. You should have a very good sense of what you're going to land at because you've been working on this 30 days for 90 days worth. So there's that discussion. We'll break it in chunks. The next one is going to be what's going to happen in the next 60 days. Okay. That adds to the 30. So it really brings you 90 days out, which is basically looking at your quarter or there through the course of the quarter, depending on how you're looking. And from there, you're looking at benchmark milestone things that are happening on pending group contracts, pending group blocks, pending events, citywides, things like this that will create demand for what are we going to be offering as a rate for those events, or what do we want to put as a rate for those events? What has the demand been historical for those events? Those discussions happen. And then you have post 90 days, 120 days being more of the emphasis after 120 days, just making sure you don't mess things up. What I mean by messing things up is Super Bowl's coming to your market and you didn't block your rooms or, so that you're selling them at ridiculously low rates when you know you can sell them at rack later. Those kind of things, making sure that you don't hit landmines later for not having pre-planned what's going on. Plus, those also enter into the discussion of recurring businesses, things that we know will be happening that far out already, been signed, been done, what have you. And any other things from, again, creep into the marketing discussion, things that should be made aware of that we're going to focus in on and really try to garner more demand from. So that's that discussion. What are we doing? And it usually shows, this is how the discussion goes, of this is what we're asking. This is what our software is telling us we should ask for, which is based on, as I said, the data metrics that they have. And then there's the interpretation of how accurate that representation of potential rate should be. And this is then where it begins to get a little slushy. The first question that gets usually referred to this discussion is, what is our competitors doing? In some cases, very particular competitors, because we pace ourselves according to certain properties that we are in comparison to. This should be based on your SWOT and your comp set, your accurate content, not your star report, which sometimes can get diluted for financial reasons, but your real competitors, who really is pulling what could have been your guest into their door. And this is where it doesn't get reminded of what our strategy is, of how we position our rate offerings to our competitors because of the variances of our product. It gets lost. We turn into a very competitive mindset. Why are they able to ask for $10 more for their room than we are? What makes them special? We forget that. Well, maybe it's because they have more common space and they have group blocks and they have an easier way of yielding better transient rates because they already have group block base. And so they can command a little bit higher price. Maybe their amenities are a little fresher than ours. Maybe their location is a little bit more prime for what the demand is for those particular dates. All of that doesn't often get brought into the discussion. I'm not saying that it might be not in the consideration of the minds of the people that are on the call, but it's not in the discussion. It turns into kind of a sometimes trivialistic way of looking at it. It's like, well, if they're doing that for $10 more, we're going to do $10 more. Can we really command that $10? Can we really say that it's worth it for us? Now, you can argue to say, well, if they're asking for $10 more, we don't want to leave money on the table if we could have gotten $10 more for our rate, for our rooms. So we should try it. But here's where the strategies begin to get unraveled. So let's say we go over and add $10 to our rate, blind to the amenity comparisons, product comparisons, strategy of our rates compared to others, location variations and everything. Just let's say we're in that mindset that if they can do it, we can do it, which unfortunately is most of the discussions. And we do. Do I ever go back and look at that? Sometimes we do. We go back and look. But now at this point, it's a blame game. Who do we look at that we say, because we did what you wanted, we only got this much for it? The revenue manager who's in charge of the discussion, his mea culpa, her mea culpa, is to simply say, I asked the property and they agreed we should go for the $10 rate. So his Pontius Pilate's out, man. I said, hey, I showed the data. Our competitor X is $10 above us. And what do you think about what we should do with our rate? And the property said, yes, we should raise it to $10. Revenue managers know I was off the hook. I did what they asked. The property's looking at it going, well, how much do we lose because we raised the rate? Nobody has that answer. You'd have to ask the people that did show up versus the people that didn't show up, and you can't ask both of them. So you don't really know what that is. And I'll get back to that because actually you can figure that out. So you made the rate gamble of raising it $10 to match your competitor, and it produced whatever it was. Now, whether that actually produced more or less, we'll math out in just a minute as to how to take a look at that objectively. But it never gets retreaded again. I will guarantee you that if you ever get on a revenue call and are in a position of responsibility to ask a property in front of representation of ownership or management company, the choice of raising your rate versus lowering your rate as a decision process against a comp set that may have a higher rate than you, I will guarantee you they will never tell you that they want to lower their rate. And I'm going to explain today where maybe that should be a consideration. The mantra of revenue management is yieldability. The mantra of ownership is to succeed at the goals that they've promised their investment or ownerships, the representations that they have, of continued and progressive growth. It is an unrealistic expectation that unfortunately through the history of our industry for the past 10 years plus, 10 years, 8, 9, 10, 10 years now, since 2009, has been of growth. We should always be doing better than we did before. And some of my most lively discussions with people is that they base it on a period over period. Oh, wow, March was so good for spring break. We rocked it. Why is April behind March? That's terrible. We're doing something wrong. Why are we doing this? This is because April doesn't have the same demand. But that's not what they want to hear, because in the budget world, they would have said that we will always continue to grow. You have these fluctuations up and down with a continuation, long time of growth. You don't look at period over period for everything always having to grow. You look year over year. In the same time frame, did we improve compared to what we did last year? That's a more realistic expectation. Unfortunately, with ownerships and the budget requirements that they have and management companies to appease them, they constantly push the line farther out each year, not really rationalizing whether that is a real capability or not, but an expectation of continued growth. It is a beginning flaw to the process. Budgets are based on it. Expectations and promises are done to it. Publicly traded companies bank on it. You are judged by the society of investors as to whether or not you hit goals. We've seen so many companies in the open market that even though they're incredibly profitable and grew substantially well, they didn't meet market expectations and their stocks tanked and money evaporated of value. Well, our basic ownerships work on the same principle. We are looking at the fact that they invested in this property for continued revenue growth. Continued revenue growth means it has to be in contrast to inflation and everything else that goes on with the diminishment of value of currency, and also their investment expectations, their payments on notes, the interest that they had to pay to get the notes, so forth and so on. Their expectations is continued growth, plus asset valuation, increasing assets value by growth of revenue. All these things are expected. And that all comes down to the people on the call at the property that have very large budgets to now hit, stressful goals, because they weren't given the ability to say that maybe that's a bridge too far, that maybe that's a revenue line we can't hit. None of them that would stay in their role, okay, would tell the king that he has no close and that revenue goal is not a realistic goal, that they would qualm as to why a 4.5%, 5.5%, 6% growth might actually be a quarter less or a full point less than that. It's still growth, but it's not the hard push. Because what happens with ownership is once they're done with the budget and everything else, they're sitting back waiting for expectations. If they don't see the horses running as fast as they were supposed to, they get out the management company and make them snap the whip over the horses to make sure that they keep the pace. And then if it doesn't, then they're looking for either two things: a scapegoat or an excuse. Kind of the same, but a scapegoat is poor operations. The GM just didn't keep their costs under control. They had internal financial issues. They weren't keeping their eye on the ball. They weren't doing their marketing objectives. Whatever it was, scapegoat. The other is excuse. Wow, we had lockdown. Can't sell anything when we're told we can't sell. excuse. So you can go back to the market and say, hey guys, we're really sorry. We had all these great expectations. We had all these great goals. We're probably all going to hit them. Okay. But we got locked down. And so, don't blame us. It's not our fault. Okay. That's the only two ways you get out of this loop. So going back to revenue management, you're on a call, revenue manager, ownership rep, property, GM, whatever. And you're looking at rates and you're comparing yourself to comp set and you see that there's variances to it. The first impression from an owner is that we can raise rate. If somebody else has a higher rate they're commanding in the market and we feel that we're equitable to them, okay, then we should be able to raise rate. What do they know that we don't know? Why are they doing it compared to us? We'll get back to those ideas too. From the management team, or excuse me, from the revenue team, comes the idea of accuracy of forecast. They would prefer to keep her to a realistic number that would validate their expertise in being able to predict what they should have charged. That's easier done with a lower rate than it is with a higher rate. But unfortunately, if you constantly are asking for lower rates, you're not going to stay in the revenue role too much higher because your title actually denotes revenue. And then from the property is the expectation of how to do this. How do we train our front desk staff to manipulate the conversations with walk-ins so that they don't walk out? How do we get that yieldability of the activities around our hotel so that we get more than our market fair share, at least in demand, so that we can control what rates we offer them? And how high can we push that rate? It's kind of a tug of war between, and if you've ever worked a front desk, you'll appreciate the fact that a guest comes in from whatever way you perceive them. It's rainy, it's miserable, it's late, their flight got canceled, whatever it is. And you get to be the bearer of bad news. So you're going to rock their world with a rate that they did not expect because you have them over a barrel. It's late. There's not many other immediate hotels, or you know that the hotels are sold out, or you're the only hotel in town that still has rooms, whatever, and you're going to hit them with a rate that's going to be like, oh my. And you're the bearer of bad news. It is your job to do the responsible thing with your business to offer the rates that you're being told you have to offer. But it's challenging. And a lot of times you'll find a lot of things, and this is where it goes through the unauthorized use of promotion codes. The front desk person also knows the promotions that you're doing, and they can tell the guests, well, if you go do this, you can get this rate. I can't give it to you here, but if you go do that, you can get that rate, and then I can check you in. It happens all the time. And I mean by AAA rates, AARP rates, military rates, where they're supposed to confirm that they are AARP or AAA or something, but they can give them the rate and not have to go through the authentication process. It happens a lot. Or promotions that they know are running and so forth, that there's inventory availability on and stuff that weren't closed out for that day. And they know that they can get put into systems so they don't get blamed. Hey, they went and found that offer. You guys in marketing had that offer up. They found it. They booked it. I know you wanted me to charge $400 a night, but they found that deal that was $299. I can't control that. It's about responsibility and when you don't want to take responsibility for it. So this revenue call is going on and we're comparing ourselves to competitors and we're looking for, we don't want to always be behind. It's funny. You drive in traffic and you leave enough of a gap and you know that the car that's coming up to you is going to want to cut you off. Does it make any difference to you that they get in front of you? No, but you still speed up because you don't want them to. We don't like looking at the back of somebody when we know we could be in front of them. It's an odd thing. It's a lesson learned here in Florida for a season, for me especially, where I constantly remind myself I'm not in a rush. If I leave that gap, it's safer for me because I don't have to worry about the guy in front of me jamming on his brakes and me possibly hitting him. I don't have to keep racing around above speed limits or at speed limits to keep people from getting in front of me. Keep the space. If somebody cuts in front of me, keep the space again. The idea of that kind of perceived ways why I'm bringing this up is that it comes into this conversation about rates. Some hotels in your market can get better rates than you because of the product they represent. Perhaps it's their proximity to what they're being booked for. Perhaps it's the events that they already currently have negotiations with. And for that reason, they can do rates that you can't. You don't have to always be. And that goes back to remembering your strategy. Where in the tier structure of your rates for your comp set do you want to sit? Are you always what is your strategy? Is it ADR based? Is it occupancy based? Is it RevPAR based? That has a huge tone as to where do you position yourself on rate. I will tell you a secret that I used to do way back when. I knew when the other hotels were doing revenue review calls for the week, what day that was. And you probably still do that today. You should do that today. Know when they discuss these things. And I used to know what reports they used to use. And I used to know geographically where those reporting agencies were at. And I would put ads geo-targeted to those places that were offering different rates that I wasn't actually offering, to throw them off on the report generations they were doing when they talked to their property that was my competitor about what we were doing for rates. Now, obviously, technology has improved. There's more softwares to show things. That's not a strategy I'm saying to endorse, but there was ways to spoof the system. I would also, just because I knew that there were certain hotels in my market that followed my rate strategies, okay, I would, on the day that they're doing revenue, change my rates so that when they looked at what we were doing, they adjusted their rates against rates I weren't going to maintain, because the next day I changed the rates. And that way I was able to push them out of my market, so to speak. Not being clever, being smarty, and I'm certainly not endorsing the sneakiness of this, but this is the tactical perspective of what is being used to make these decisions. A lot of times, the revenue manager will say, well, that property over there is doing, what is company? Oh, well, they're doing 189. You're doing 179. Ooh, well, should we go 189 as well? The revenue manager isn't the marketer. They don't know if 189 is sustainable. They're reporting that there's a hotel in your comp set that is commanding 189. They turn to the property to have the excuse, the scapegoat, that I didn't make the decision. I offered what the information was, and they said, yes, let's go up to 189. Because they're sitting in front of the ownership that's going, why would you not want to go up in rates if it's available? Not whether it's rational. So let's break down the rate impacts by doing this. I did a little napkin math about this. First off, one thing I noticed in these conversations about looking at our comp sets is we don't often look at the current occupancies that might be driving their rate strategy. We know in general terms the occupancies of the hotels, and some reports do actually have estimated occupancies that the hotels have, but it's not in part of the report process for the discussion of decisions. So why are they able to ask that rate? Why are they asking that rate for? And a lot of times that boils down to the engagement of the property, that the salesperson who talks to the salesperson over there says, well, they got that big wedding in, or, they're right next door to the Lollapalooza festival. So they're getting everybody over there. Or they have the crews in from the show over here, whatever it is. It's usually from firsthand or secondhand information in market that gives some interpretation, okay, of the possibility of why they're asking that rate. But it's not based on actual data. This is, well, they're at 85% occupancy, and they're a 200-room hotel, so they have 30 more rooms to sell. So they're asking 189 because they only have a few rooms to sell with it. We'll get back to that strategy in just a second. The other is pace and trend. We've talked about it on the show before. That isn't really a part of the conversation when it comes to revenue management as much as it should be. And again, we'll do some napkin math with this. So say, for instance, you have a 100-room hotel and you're charging $100 a night. You're at 80% occupancy, so you have a total of 20 more rooms to sell over the next 10 days. We're keeping everything nice and round in 10, okay? Your competitors, and you consider them equal in scope and value proposition, are now charging $110 a night. Okay. We don't know where their occupancy is. Let's just leave it at that. We just see the pure rate of, okay, it's 110 versus 100 for me. And I have 30 more rooms to sell. 20 more rooms to sell. So length of stay is well, let's just keep it simple. 20 rooms per night to sell. So if I do 110, then that effectively means that I will get an extra 5 rooms worth of revenue without having to sell 5 more rooms to do it. I like that. Okay, that's good yield. All right. Well, how does that affect the pace of pickup? Now, if you look at pace, you're picking up a room a day for this time frame of what you're looking for. Okay, occupancies. Like I said, it's 10 days out. So you're picking up a room a day. right now at $100. So that means that you're expected to, on that date, have a 90% occupancy, not 100%, at $100 a day. So if you increase it to 110, are you considering to look at the pace impact on that after 2 to 3 days to say, did I still continue to pick up one room a day, even though I raised the rate? Because if that's the case, that was a very smart move. Maybe there's more room for the rate to be increased. If I lost one room a day, where I'm now, instead for the 3 days, I only picked up 2 rooms. Well, that's still not bad, because that third room I would have picked up, I compensated with the extra $10 in rate. Not completely, but it's contributing towards it. And if I pace for that, I'll end up at a lower occupancy in the 10 days to say 85 rooms, but I'll have made as if I had done 7 rooms. So the pace loss is not that bad. But if my pace dropped off by going up to 110, does anybody go back and look at it and say, wow, we were getting a room a day at $100. But as soon as we went up to 110, for 3 days, we've got no rooms. We need to bring that back down. Now, we do have a pace report as to the pickup each day, and we see the pace pickup for what each day is supposed to be reflecting. But I can honestly tell you in revenue management calls that that pace calculation per day of pickup is never remembered from 1 week to the next or every 2 weeks from the next, as to, did that match what we had before? Did that match what our expectations are? Now, there are reports that will show last year's pace to this year's pace. Given the fact that there's 2 variables to any comparison year over year, and that is the days don't match. Last year was Thursday, this year's Friday. Okay, different paces. Secondly, are there same recurring events happening last year, this year? Was there an event last year that isn't this year, or vice versa? Is the same conditions of travel the same, like in the sense that there's not restrictions or changes as we've had to go through these past couple of years? And the third aspect of it is there a impact on things that are different from last year to this year? And that is weather, flights. We'll get to that to the news coverage today. Is there things that are impacting the potential demand that makes a variance to this? Honestly, nobody remembers all this stuff, because one, the crew that's on this call for this year may not have been the crew from last year to even remember the day. Secondly, are they going to remember it down to the day? Which goes back to a conversation we had a few shows back on, I think, show 380, 81, where we talked about logs and journals, where we have a way to go back to in time, back to what was written last year, this date, and go, weather was crappy, no many walk-ins, so forth and so on. Well, we looking at this weather and it'd be like, well, we got great weather this time. And the things that they said they had problems with last year with airline flights and so forth, we don't have them this year. So yeah, our expectation is that our pickup opportunity is better. That's where logs come in and are helpful for that. So pace is a critical component in the process, but it's looked at the time for the rate decision. And that's usually, and this is the truth of the data, is the pace that you're seeing on that date is based on the current rate. And people forget that, because if you put the rate up, that's going to impact your pace. If it doesn't, then you've been giving away the rooms of too much of a lower rate. You should have been talking about the week before, because you should incrementally be adjusting those rates to see if it impacts the pace, not the comparison of comp set. Comp set only gives you the excuse to raise rate. It doesn't give you the justification for it. And that's the key element to that revenue strategy conversation, is understanding why you're making the decisions that you are. Okay. That pace impact has to be recorded in your revenue calls. Okay, guys, here's a snapshot. Last week, our pace was X per day for these dates. Well, a week later, our revenue call, we adjusted the rates. Our pace went up or down from that decision. Now, math-wise, what is the trend to where we're going to hit? That's the next second question after the pace impact is, with that being said, what is our expected growth final for that day? What is our actualization for that day based on current pace, based on current rate? If it's to the satisfaction of what you wanted for that day, why are you trying to raise it again? If it didn't get negatively impacted by the raise in rate, it's considered that you might want to think about raising it again for yieldability. If it had a negative impact on pace and you are going below the threshold of expectation for that day, then you should reduce the rate. A word that never gets used much in the revenue calls. Let's dial it back down. Let's get back to where the demand is for rate to get our financial goal based on the occupancy or RevPAR for that day. Now, that lends itself to a more occupancy RevPAR based strategy compared to an ADR strategy. ADR strategies are sexy. They look great. Look at how much we're growing. Look at our market penetration compared to our comp set. All feel good, fun stuff. And it does gen revenue to the point where it stops generating incremental revenue. You're generating revenue, but at what cost? Now, you can go through the idea of ADR strategies as preservation of asset, reduce stress and impact on it, reduction of hardline costs of repairs and maintenance and so forth. There's arguments on every angle about running a hotel. Been there, done that. The idea is what works for you. And I would say that you don't walk around beating your chest that we are an ADR focused strategy 100%, because that's blind. Just as much as you don't walk around saying you're an occupancy based strategy, that's blind. It's as much as you don't walk around saying I'm a RevPAR centric, okay, or GoPAR, all these things. You are flexible according to the demands to market. There are times where you can command ADR rate, and there's days where you really just need to focus on the demand to your market, and the ADR is not going to be able to continue to be grown. Go for the occupancy. So it's a fluctuation of what your demand is and the purpose of the demand to your market that should dictate your revenue management strategy and rate discussions. So pace is the key element to that. Impact of the decisions of pace, of rate changes, is the second. And the third is the realignment of what you're doing to touch onto the demand. Now, there are other variables. This is just purely rate discussion of rate offering versus rate response to that offering. When you start bringing in the infusion of what marketing can do and should do for you, how can we influence the demand of market? How can we steal other demand to market from our competitors? How can we maybe funnel people that if we are going to keep a moderate rate at a tiered level compared to our competitors, and we know our comp set is asking for higher rates, how can we use that in our advantage to basically steal who would go to their hotel and pay the extra dollars to stay at our hotel and not have to pay the extra dollars? What do we push forward? Our review scores, our quality of location in comparison, if that's a motivator, our comparison to the venue, if that's a motivator, our amenity comparison, if that's the motivator. Being granular in the interpretation of how we respond to our rate strategy in comparison to our comp set is more of a marketing discussion than it is a revenue discussion. And it is tempered by sales' insight on what they can contribute to compress the inventory availability for transient. Transient's the rich, fat, low-hanging fruit that everybody wants. They love the transient business revenue. It's higher rated. It's more affordable. It's not under negotiations for reduction in costs. But group business, that compression that it creates, the business that it generates, is a key component to understanding the ebbs and flows of demand to market. Group demand to market is a huge canary in the coal mine for demand to market. If people are willing to bring their groups and businesses and corporate travel negotiation business to your market, it's a healthy destination. Obviously, resorts and transitory specific destinations don't have that as much of a concern. It's all centric on the type of business you're trying to demand. But for those that have that in your market, it is a key component. So you also need to determine, and I mean this from a math sense, your LOA, the LOS demand for the dates that you're looking at rate changes. If you're looking at single day rate changes and you're not looking at the impact on the length of stay cycle that date represents, some people, there's heavy Thursday check-ins, departure Saturdays, early arrivals Friday, departure Sundays, whatever, and you're not putting fences to stretch those or shoulder those. And also, if you're just focused on a single date rate and not realizing that it's going to influence length of stay, that if you go from a $150 rate on a Thursday to a $200 rate on Friday, but your normal arrival departure dates are Thursday through Saturday, you might get somebody that was considering you now out of contention. And not only did you not get them for the Friday that you tried to jack the rate because you thought the demand was there, but you lost them on the Thursday because of it. These impacts of length of stay have to be in the discussion when you're deciding on the metrics of rate. Why do you want to? So what I'm trying to get away from is that I see so many conversations with revenue management that are about the cosmetics of culpability, blame versus, well, I asked the property, they wanted to raise rate because their comp had an extra $10 on whatever. That's not the purpose of the decision. The purpose of the decision is it sound of mind for the strategy we have based on the length of stay impact, based on the demand to market, based on our pace from year over year and the considerations of variances between those, and the pace that we see at the current rate and the impact of what of a change in rate would do to that. Those are the deciding metrics for revenue management rate changes. That's the part that needs to get included in that discussion. So, axe to grind, soapbox to stand on. I can say that so many times revenue management calls continue to go the way of, well, I'm in front of ownership and I'm not going to tell them to lower rate. So we're going to keep raising rate. And there's a negative impact on revenue. And they wonder why they just squeezed the turnip too hard and there was not enough juice out of the beet or whatever. When you squeeze a stone, put two pennies together, lots of analogies there. Anyways, I want to get to a little news topic that's more of an opinion topic for me. Just this past week, FAA had their meltdown on data. Canada had the same issue with theirs. Strangely enough, their security, their system that informs pilots as to all the things that they need to be concerned with when flying between destinations. This is in a series of just negative on top of negative on top of negative. Southwest meltdown, week and a half ago, over the holidays. The summer fiasco. Well, we had it for Christmas too, that all the airlines, but they recovered. Southwest didn't. They melted down. Summer's fiasco over July. And my question to the news component of this, are we getting a fear of flying? It's like round and round and round she goes, wait until the music stops, and is there still a chair to sit in? So many people, and I mean hundreds of thousands, millions of people have had a negative experience with flying in the past 6 months. Millions. With the expense of travel as it is, and the high rates and costs and so forth, our own efforts as hoteliers to maximize our rates, we just had that discussion. The cost of gas, the cost of everything. We are seeing champions of people that are deciding to rent buses and take a road trip and chronicle their trip on a social media platform. And we herald them as innovative. What it is a blatant slap in the face of our ability to provide service of hospitality. And I say that directly to flying. I think we've discussed in my prognostications from the show last week or 2 weeks ago that the revenge travel is over. People have gotten it out of their system. They got a bad taste in their mouth. The first year, it was our fault because we exploited rate during the first summer of the tsunami of demand when people were first allowed to travel back in 2021. And then we exacerbated that ourselves again in summer. And the airlines put another nail in the coffin by their fiasco in the summer. And then they, of course, put another nail in the coffin with the fiasco over the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then now the meltdown of FAA. A lot of people, I think, in their scope of perspective for spring break as the next initiative for mass travel and summer travel, that people are literally looking at options that they have more control over and less at mercy of the platforms that they use, such as flying. I think that this is a strong impact on our marketing strategy upcoming. I think it's a strong impact on our strategies upcoming. And I believe it would be very smart of resorts, properties, and everything to really be centric on talking and addressing the alternative ways of getting to them and the most beneficial markets that would have the ease in getting to them as well, and soliciting them and getting early bookings by offering the incentives of kind of a makeup of, we're going to give you the quality service we seem to have missed these past 2 years. So I think that would be a strong lead to the idea. But I do believe that there's a fear of flying and that it is producing a negative impact on our future travel demands for 2023. So there you have it. That is my discussion today. Our topic, of course, was how do you really decide your daily rate changes? And the news idea was the fear of flying, the negative impact that all of these flying issues have exacerbated in our society. So I thank you for the privilege of your time of joining us live today, if that is what you did on either Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube, and the multiple channels on there. Or watched us on TV on our TV channel, the Hospitality Channel, which you can get on Roku, Google, Amazon, or Apple. We will have, as always, our weekly podcast, our audio cast that we put on 39 platforms, iTunes and everything else, iHeartRadio, Spotify, what have you. That we do a quick recap of what we just discussed about. Plus, we also talk about some tools that we use for particular tasks. I'm not going to give away the secret today. You're just going to have to go look at episode number 388 on your podcast player and see what tools we bring up for discussion today. So with that, my name is Loren Gray. I thank you for the privilege of your time, and I look forward to talking to you next week.